In the winter of 1791, in a quiet corner of Spain where stone walls held the cold long after sunset, an object meant to be silent became the center of growing dread. It was not a weapon, not a body, not a confession extracted under torture. It was a diary, leather-bound, modest in size, filled with the careful handwriting of a man who believed, like everyone else, that death was an ending. The pages were meant to stop. The ink was meant to dry forever. But it didn't. Long after the funeral bells had rung, long after the grave soil had been pressed flat, new words appeared. At first, it was dismissed as a mistake, a trick of memory, a page that must have been overlooked. In a world where candles flickered unevenly and records were kept by hand, certainty was fragile. But as the days passed, the diary continued to change. Dates advanced beyond the day of death. Sentences formed that no living hand was supposed to be able to write. And slowly, an unbearable question crept into the minds of those who saw it. What if the dead were not as still as they appeared? This was not an age of science as we understand it today. Spain in the late 18th century lived in the shadow of faith, fear, and authority. Death was familiar, too familiar, but understanding it was shallow. People died quickly, often without explanation. Illness blurred into sin. Suffering was interpreted as divine will. And when something occurred that did not fit neatly into scripture or superstition, the response was rarely calm. It was terror. The diary belonged to a man who had documented his life with unusual intensity. His entries spoke of routine matters, weather, health, prayer, but beneath them ran a current of unease. He wrote as if time were chasing him, as if he feared interruption, as if something unfinished loomed just beyond the page. When he fell ill, the writing grew tighter, more erratic. When he died, the final entry ended mid-thought, the ink trailing off as though the pen had been pulled away. That should have been the end of it. Instead, days later, the diary was opened again. The handwriting was unmistakable. The same slant, the same pressure, the same peculiar way certain letters curled inward. But the date was wrong. It was written after the burial, after witnesses had seen the body lowered into the ground, after prayers had been spoken for a soul believed to have departed. Those who saw the new entry did not scream. They did not immediately accuse. They froze, because what they were looking at was not a ghost story told by firelight. It was a physical object changing in front of them, violating the most basic rule of existence, that the dead do not continue. The words themselves were worse than the phenomenon. They did not proclaim resurrection or divine revelation. They did not speak with clarity or authority. They were confused, fragmented, written as if from a place of darkness and disorientation. There were references to silence that pressed inward, to a weight that would not lift, to an awareness without movement. It was not the language of heaven, and it was not the language of peace. Rumors spread quietly at first. A servant whispered to a neighbor. A neighbor mentioned it after confession. Each retelling added fear but stripped certainty. Was it a miracle? A warning? A deception by the devil? Or something far more disturbing, that the boundary between life and death had not held as firmly as everyone believed? The church could not ignore it. Neither could the family. Neither could the local authorities, who understood that panic did not need truth to spread. It only needed plausibility. And this diary, sitting on a table, ink dark and fresh, was plausible enough to unravel an entire community's understanding of death. This was a time when premature burial was not a distant fear but a documented horror. Bells were attached to coffins. Graves were sometimes reopened. Medicine could not reliably distinguish death from deep coma, catalepsy, or shock. People vanished into the ground while still alive more often than history is comfortable admitting. And once that possibility entered the conversation, the diary became something else entirely. Not a supernatural curiosity, but a potential message from a consciousness trapped where no consciousness should be. But there was another possibility, one equally unsettling, that someone living was writing in the voice of the dead. That grief, guilt, or obsession had driven a hand to mimic the departed so perfectly that even those who knew him best could not tell the difference. If that were true, then the diary was not evidence of life after death, but of something breaking among the living. Each explanation was horrifying in its own way. If the dead man was writing, then death was not an ending. If someone else was writing, then the human mind was capable of frightening precision in deception and self-delusion. And if neither explanation fully fit, then the truth lay somewhere darker, where categories failed. What makes this case endure is not that it was ever conclusively proven. It wasn't. The diary would eventually disappear from public record, sealed away or lost, leaving behind only testimonies, fragments, and unease. But the reactions it provoked were real. The fear was real. The ink, according to multiple witnesses, was real. This is not a story about a haunted object in the modern sense. It is a story about a moment when certainty collapsed, when educated men and devout clergy stared at a page and could not explain how it came to be, when the idea that death might be porous, that consciousness might linger, confused and aware, felt suddenly possible. And that is why this diary still matters. Because beneath the folklore, beneath the theology, beneath the skepticism, it forces a question we still struggle to answer centuries later. How sure are we that death happens all at once? Or does it sometimes arrive slowly, leaving the mind awake while the world moves on without it? In 1791, Spain was not ready for that question. And neither, perhaps, are we. To understand why a single diary could terrify an entire community in 1791, it is necessary to understand the world in which it appeared. Spain at the end of the 18th century was a nation caught between eras, suspended in an uneasy transition where old beliefs still ruled daily life, even as new ideas quietly pressed at the edges. This was not a society that treated unexplained phenomena lightly. It was one conditioned to fear disorder, to distrust anomalies, and to interpret the unknown through the lens of divine judgment or moral failure. The Catholic Church dominated nearly every aspect of Spanish life. Faith was not a private matter. It was the foundation of law, education, medicine, and social order. Births were recorded by priests. Deaths were sanctified through ritual. Illness was prayed over before it was examined. The Church offered certainty in a world filled with uncertainty, and in return, it demanded obedience. Although the Spanish Inquisition had begun to lose its overt power by the late 1700s, its psychological presence remained deeply embedded. The memory of trials, confessions, and public punishments had taught generations that deviation, whether in belief or behavior, carried consequences. At the same time, the Enlightenment was slowly filtering into Spain from the rest of Europe. Ideas about reason, empiricism, and natural law were circulating among scholars and physicians, though often behind closed doors. Publicly, tradition still reigned. Privately, doubts were growing. This created a cultural tension that made unexplained events especially volatile. A miracle could be celebrated. A mystery could be condemned. But something that hovered between the two, neither wholly nor clearly fraudulent, was dangerous. Death, in particular, occupied a central and constant place in daily life. Life expectancy was short. Epidemics moved through cities without warning. Child mortality was staggering. People did not fear death in the abstract. They lived alongside it. Corpses were prepared at home. Graves were shallow and often reused. The boundary between the living and the dead was physically close, emotionally raw, and never fully secure. Yet for all its familiarity, death was poorly understood. Medical knowledge was limited and inconsistent. Physicians relied on observation, tradition, and theory rather than standardized testing. Vital signs as we understand them today were unreliable indicators. A body that did not respond, did not breathe visibly, and did not react to pain could be declared dead even if some internal awareness remained. Conditions like catalepsy, severe shock, epileptic stupor, and certain fevers could mimic death convincingly. There was no electrocardiogram, no brain activity monitoring, no clear line between life and its absence. This uncertainty fed one of the era's deepest fears: premature burial. It was not superstition, it was a documented reality. Accounts circulated across Europe of coffins found scratched from the inside, of corpses discovered in twisted positions after exhumation. Safety coffins with bells and ventilation tubes were proposed precisely because the fear was justified. To be buried alive was not merely a nightmare, it was a known risk. Within this context, the idea that a dead man's diary could continue after burial was not immediately dismissed as impossible. It was horrifying, yes, but horrifying in a way that felt disturbingly plausible. If death could be misjudged, then consciousness could be trapped. If consciousness could be trapped, then perhaps it could reach out in the only way it knew how, through writing. Religion offered explanations, but they were not comforting. Catholic doctrine emphasized purgatory, a state of suffering and purification after death. Souls were believed to be conscious, aware, and capable of regret. They could not interact with the physical world directly, but stories of signs, warnings, and divine messages were common. A diary that continued after death could be interpreted as a soul crying out, trapped between worlds, desperate to be heard. There was also the darker theological explanation: demonic interference. The devil, according to church teaching, was capable of imitation and deception. He could mimic voices, appearances, and even handwriting to sow doubt and fear. A diary that wrote itself could be seen not as proof of survival after death, but as a spiritual attack, a test of faith meant to destabilize belief and invite sin. Neither explanation offered peace. Both demanded action. Social structure amplified the fear. Spain in 1791 was hierarchical and communal. News did not spread through newspapers or broadcasts. It traveled through mouths, confessionals, and marketplaces. Once a rumor began, it did not remain neutral. It evolved. Details sharpened. Motives were assigned. A single strange event could quickly become a symbol of divine displeasure or moral decay. Privacy was rare. Families lived closely, often with servants and extended relatives. Secrets were difficult to keep, and once exposed, they took on lives of their own. If a diary was discovered to be changing, it would not remain a private concern for long. Each person who saw it brought their own fears, beliefs, and interpretations, layering meaning onto the object until it became something larger than itself. The role of authority was equally important. Local officials were responsible not only for law and order, but for maintaining spiritual calm. Panic was a threat. Heresy was a threat. Anything that could disrupt public faith or invite questioning of doctrine had to be controlled. This is why anomalies were often investigated quietly, documented selectively, and sometimes removed from circulation entirely. In this world, evidence did not need to be overwhelming to be believed. It needed only to fit within existing fears. A diary continuing after death did not challenge belief in God. It challenged belief in the finality of death. It suggested that the transition from life to whatever came next was not clean, not instant, and not merciful. This was a deeply unsettling idea in a society that relied on ritual closure. Last rites, burial, and prayer were meant to seal the passage. They reassured the living that the dead were no longer suffering. A diary that defied that narrative implied failure, of medicine, of ritual, or of faith itself. The Enlightenment thinkers of the time might have searched for rational explanations, but their voices were quiet compared to the authority of tradition. And even they could not explain everything. Without forensic science, without psychological frameworks, without neurological understanding, certainty was elusive. So when new words appeared on a page that should have been finished, Spain in 1791 did not ask whether the story was entertaining or symbolic. It asked whether something had gone terribly wrong in the natural order. Whether a man had been buried too soon. Whether a soul was trapped. Or whether something unseen had learned to write. That is the world in which this diary emerged, a world primed to fear it, to believe it, and to never fully escape its implications. The man who kept the diary was not famous, powerful, or outwardly remarkable, and that is precisely what makes his words so unsettling. He was an ordinary man by the standards of his time, educated enough to write with consistency and care, devout enough to structure his days around prayer and obligation, and introspective in a way that was uncommon but not unheard of. His life left few marks on official records, yet his inner world was preserved line by line in ink, revealing a mind that watched itself closely, sometimes too closely. From the earliest surviving entries, the diary reads less like a record of events and more like a negotiation with time. He documented mundane details, meals, weather, visits, minor ailments, but these were often followed by reflections that lingered longer than necessary. He returned repeatedly to thoughts of decay, of the body's fragility, of the uncertainty of God's judgment. There was no grand confession of crime or scandal, but there was a persistent tone of vigilance, as if he feared that something unnoticed might one day be counted against him. He wrote with discipline. The entries followed a pattern, often made at the same hour, using the same phrasing to mark the beginning and end. This ritualistic quality suggests a man who found comfort in structure, who believed that order on the page might impose order on the world. Yet beneath that order was a tension that never quite resolved. Certain phrases reappeared with subtle variation, as though he was circling an idea he could not confront directly. Illness appears early in the diary, though not in dramatic form. He complained of weakness, of sudden exhaustion, of moments where his limbs felt heavy or distant. At first, These were dismissed by him as ordinary signs of aging or overwork. But over time, the language changed. He began to describe sensations that were harder to categorize: a pressure behind the eyes, a feeling of being awake while not fully present, episodes of stillness where minutes seemed to vanish without memory. He did not write of fear in explicit terms. Instead, he wrote of preparation. He recorded prayers more carefully. He noted unfinished tasks and unresolved obligations. He began to mention time not as something passing, but as something narrowing. There is an urgency in the later entries that is subtle but unmistakable, a sense that the act of writing itself had become necessary, as though stopping might invite something worse. His relationship with death was complex. He did not romanticize it, nor did he openly dread it. Rather, he treated it as an inevitable appointment that required readiness. He referenced burial rites, the importance of confession, the dangers of dying unprepared. These were common concerns in 18th century Spain, but in his diary they carry a personal weight, as if he felt himself approaching a threshold he could not yet see. What is most striking is how often he wrote about silence. Not the peaceful silence of prayer or solitude, but an oppressive stillness that pressed inward. He described moments where sound seemed distant, where voices reached him as if through water. In one entry, he noted the sensation of being present but unable to respond, though he attributed it to fatigue. Read in isolation, these passages seem benign. Read in sequence, they form a pattern that becomes impossible to ignore. There is no evidence that he intended his diary to be read by others. The tone is private, sometimes fragmented, sometimes repetitive, as though he were writing to reassure himself rather than to inform a future reader. This lends credibility to the authenticity of the voice. There is no performance here, no attempt to craft a legacy. The writing exists because he needed it to exist. As his health declined, the physical characteristics of the diary changed as well. The handwriting tightened. The spacing between lines narrowed. Ink strokes grew heavier in certain places, as though the pen had paused and pressed before moving on. Some entries end abruptly, without the closing phrase he had used for years. Others repeat a single sentence twice, then cross it out, then write it again slightly differently. It is the writing of a mind struggling to maintain coherence while something slips beneath the surface. Friends and family noticed his withdrawal. He attended fewer gatherings, spoke less, listened more. When asked about his health, he minimized his symptoms, framing them as temporary or insignificant. This was not unusual behavior in a culture that valued stoicism and faith over complaint. But in hindsight, it appears as another layer of isolation, a man turning inward as his body betrayed him. In the final entries written before his reported death, the diary becomes noticeably unsettled. Dates are still recorded, but the reflections grow shorter and more urgent. He writes of waking without rest, of feeling as though he has already crossed something and returned incomplete. There is a recurring phrase, slightly altered each time, that suggests an awareness of interruption, of being stopped mid-thought. The last entry attributed to his life ends without closure. The sentence breaks off, the ink thinning as though the pen had been lifted suddenly or dropped. There is no signature, no concluding prayer. It is not the deliberate ending of a man who has finished his account. It feels like a moment cut short. This incomplete ending is crucial, because it establishes the diary not as a finished artifact, but as a process. A conversation that was never meant to stop abruptly. When death followed shortly after, those who knew him believed the diary had simply ended where his life did. They could not have known that this sense of interruption would later define the entire mystery. If the diary had been written by a man consumed with superstition or known for deceit, it would be easier to dismiss what followed. But he was neither. His writing reveals a cautious, methodical personality, deeply embedded in the norms of his time. There is no evidence of theatricality or a desire to shock. The fear that seeps through the pages is quiet, internal, and unadorned. This makes the later entries, those written after death, all the more disturbing, because they do not emerge from a void. They continue a voice that already existed, already struggled, already feared silence and interruption. Whether written by his hand, another's, or something else entirely, they grow out of a psychological landscape that was already prepared. In this sense, the diary is not merely a record of events. It is a map of a mind approaching a boundary without fully understanding what lay beyond it. And when that boundary was crossed, or believed to be crossed, the writing did not resolve. It changed. It fractured. It continued. That continuity is what refuses to let the story rest. The illness that led to his death did not arrive suddenly, nor did it announce itself with the kind of violence that demanded immediate alarm. It unfolded gradually, almost quietly, allowing denial and misinterpretation to settle in long before fear took hold. In a time when disease was poorly understood and often misnamed, symptoms were interpreted through experience rather than diagnosis. What he described as fatigue was assumed to be weakness. What he felt as heaviness was dismissed as age. And what would later seem like warning signs were treated as inconveniences rather than threats. As the weeks passed, his condition worsened in subtle ways. He began sleeping for long stretches, yet waking without rest. There were moments when he appeared distant, as if his attention had retreated inward. At times, he did not respond immediately when spoken to, though his eyes remained open. Such behavior was unsettling, but not unheard of. People whispered of nerves, of melancholy, of spiritual exhaustion. Few suspected anything more dangerous. Medical intervention, such as it was, followed the customs of the era. A physician was consulted, his methods rooted in humoral theory and observation rather than evidence. The body was believed to be governed by balances of fluids, and illness was treated through purging, bleeding, and dietary restriction. None of these measures addressed the true nature of what was happening, because no one fully understood it. When the treatments failed to produce improvement, they were repeated, sometimes with greater severity. During this period, the diarist wrote less frequently, but with increased urgency. Entries became shorter, more fragmented. He noted periods of immobility, of awareness without movement, though he framed them as weakness rather than paralysis. He wrote of hearing voices at a distance, of feeling present yet removed. These sensations were frightening, but he did not articulate fear directly. Instead, he documented them with the same restrained precision he applied to everything else, as though naming them might contain them. Then, one evening, he failed to respond at all. Those present believed he had fallen into a deep sleep. His chest rose shallowly, his skin cool but not cold. Hours passed without change. By morning, his breathing was imperceptible. His pulse, if present, was too faint to detect with certainty. The physician was summoned again and declared death, relying on the standards available at the time: unresponsiveness, lack of visible breath, pallor. There was no attempt at revival beyond rudimentary stimulation. No one waited long. The announcement of death brought with it a swift shift in ritual. In 18th century Spain, the dead were not kept long. Fear of decay and disease encouraged rapid burial. The body was washed, dressed, and laid out. Candles were lit. Prayers were spoken. The diary was removed from his personal effects and placed aside, its final entry assumed complete. Yet even during these preparations, there were moments that troubled those in attendance. His body did not stiffen as expected. There was no immediate onset of rigor mortis. Some noted a warmth lingering longer than usual. Others dismissed these observations as imagination, born of grief and fatigue. Death, after all, did not follow a precise schedule. The funeral proceeded without delay. The coffin was closed. The grave was dug. Soil fell. With each step, the assumption that the man was truly gone hardened into certainty, reinforced by ritual and authority. Once buried, he was considered beyond reach. Whatever he had been suffering from was no longer a concern for the living. But death, as declared, was not the same as death as experienced. What no one could know at the time was that certain conditions could induce a state of profound stillness that mimicked death almost perfectly. Catalepsy, for example, could render a person immobile and unresponsive, with slowed respiration and pulse. Severe shock could do the same. Certain neurological events could trap consciousness inside a body unable to signal its presence. These phenomena were not understood, and even if they had been suspected, there was little that could be done. The possibility that he had not truly died lingered unspoken, buried beneath ritual and relief. For the living, closure was necessary. To question death was to invite unbearable responsibility. Better to trust the declaration and move on. In the days that followed, the household returned to a fragile normalcy. Mourning followed prescribed forms. Visitors came and left. The diary remained untouched, assumed to be a relic of a life concluded. It was not revisited immediately. There was no reason to. It belonged to the past. Yet something about the death did not settle easily. Those who had been present found themselves replaying moments in their minds: the lingering warmth, the lack of stiffness, the ambiguous stillness. Doubt crept in slowly, unwelcome and unspoken. There was no evidence to support it, and evidence was everything. Without it, doubt was merely fear. The first true disruption came not from memory, but from ink. When the diary was eventually opened again, whether out of habit, curiosity, or a desire for comfort, it revealed something that should not have been there. A new entry. Dated after the burial. Written in the same hand. The implications of this discovery reached backward in time, casting the circumstances of his death into a new, terrifying light. If the diary entry was genuine, then the declaration of death had been wrong. The burial had been premature. The rituals meant to bring peace had instead sealed something unfinished. The silence that followed the funeral had not been the silence of rest, but of confinement. Alternatively, if the entry was not genuine, then someone had intervened after the fact, altering a sacred object tied to death. This raised its own questions of motive and sanity. Why continue the voice of a dead man? Why mimic his hand so precisely? Why choose a diary rather than a letter or proclamation? The ambiguity of the death became the foundation of the entire mystery. Without certainty about when life ended, every explanation remained possible. The line between the living and the dead, already thin in the cultural imagination, blurred beyond recognition. What had been assumed final was suddenly provisional. The burial, once a conclusion, became a question mark. And the diary, once a personal record, became a potential testimony from a place no one was meant to hear from. Whether he died that night or lingered beyond it, the manner of his passing ensured that closure would never fully arrive. The rituals had been performed. The prayers had been spoken. But something essential had been missed. And whatever it was, it did not remain silent. The moment the diary was opened again was not dramatic in the way legends often describe. There was no thunder, no sudden chill, no immediate cry of alarm. It was an ordinary action, performed without expectation, and that is what made the discovery so devastating. Someone, accounts differ on who exactly, lifted the worn leather cover and turned past familiar pages, expecting to find only what had already been read before. The handwriting was known. The rhythm of the entries was known. The ending, abrupt as it was, had already been accepted. Then the eye fell on a page that should not have existed. At first, confusion took precedence over fear. The date was wrong. It came after the recorded day of death, after the burial, after the final prayers. The mind instinctively searched for a simpler explanation. Perhaps the date had been misread. Perhaps the diarist had written ahead, mistaken the day, grown confused. But the numbers were clear, written with the same deliberate care that marked the rest of the diary. There was no sign of hesitation, no correction. Then came the deeper realization: the ink was fresh. This detail appears again and again in later testimonies. The ink had not faded or dried to the dull brown of older entries. It was dark, rich, slightly glossy when caught by candlelight. Some claimed it smudged faintly when touched, though whether this was true or imagined remains uncertain. What mattered was the shared perception that this writing was new, not merely newly discovered. The handwriting itself removed any lingering hope of coincidence. It was unmistakable. The same narrow spacing. The same pressure at the beginning of each line. The same peculiar formation of certain letters that no one else in the household reproduced. Even those skeptical of supernatural explanations struggled with this detail. Forgery was not impossible, but it was difficult to imagine such precision achieved without long practice, and without motive. The content of the entry did not offer clarity or comfort. It was not a farewell. It did not proclaim survival or resurrection. It read like a continuation of something already in motion. The sentences were short, uneven, as if written with effort. There were references to darkness, to weight, to stillness that would not break. One phrase, repeated twice with slight variation, suggested awareness without agency, a mind awake in a body that would not answer. Those who read it described an immediate, visceral reaction. Not fear in the sense of danger, but dread, the sense that something profoundly wrong had been glimpsed. This was not a message meant for reassurance. It was not framed as communication at all. It was simply there, as if the act of writing had resumed automatically, without regard for the impossibility of the situation. The diary was closed almost as soon as it was opened. Silence followed, heavy and uncertain. No one present wanted to be the first to speak, because to speak was to acknowledge what they had seen. And once acknowledged, It could not be dismissed. When discussion did begin, it circled the same fragile questions. Could the man have written this before his death and simply failed to date it correctly? Could someone else have added the entry as a cruel joke or misguided act of grief? Could the diary have been tampered with unintentionally? Each suggestion was raised, examined, and quietly set aside. None fully accounted for the combination of handwriting, ink, date, and tone. Access became a critical concern. Who had been near the diary since the death? Who had the opportunity to write in it? The list was short. The diary had been kept among personal belongings, not left openly displayed. Those with access denied touching it. Their denials were not defensive, but frightened. No one wanted to be associated with what was quickly becoming something dangerous. As word spread within the household, reactions varied. Some refused to look at the diary again, believing that attention itself might invite further disturbance. Others felt compelled to read it, drawn by a need to understand. One account describes a servant crossing herself repeatedly after seeing the page, whispering prayers under her breath as though warding off contamination. The question that lingered unspoken was the most terrifying one. If the writing was genuine, where had it been written from? If the man had been buried alive, the diary represented an echo from beneath the ground, a record of awareness trapped in darkness. If this were the case, then the words were not merely strange, they were accusations. They suggested error, haste, and an irreversible failure to protect life. This interpretation carried unbearable weight. It transformed a mystery into a moral catastrophe. Alternatively, if the man was truly dead, then the writing implied something else entirely. It suggested that death did not sever all ties, that consciousness, or something mimicking it, could persist and act. This possibility unsettled even those accustomed to religious explanations. Souls were believed to suffer or rejoice, not to continue mundane acts like diary writing. This was too ordinary to be divine, too personal to be symbolic. As the days passed, the diary was opened again. Accounts differ on whether this was done deliberately to observe it, or whether curiosity overcame caution. What matters is that the phenomenon did not stop. Another entry appeared. Then another. Each dated sequentially. Each written in the same hand. The language shifted subtly with each edition. Grammar loosened. Repetition increased. Certain words appeared obsessively, as though the writer were fixated on a single sensation or idea. There were references to time passing without markers, to sound that could not be reached, to an effort that produced no movement. It read less like communication and more like endurance. Fear escalated. The diary was no longer a private concern. It became a source of unease that demanded explanation. The household argued over what to do. Destroying it felt dangerous, almost sacrilegious. Preserving it felt equally risky. Every new entry deepened the sense that something was unfolding beyond control. What made the situation worse was the consistency. There were no grand revelations, no sudden changes in voice or perspective. The writing did not escalate into madness or clarity. It simply continued, as though the act of writing were the only remaining proof of existence. This continuity made deception harder to believe. A hoax usually reveals itself through excess. This did not. The diary had crossed a threshold. It was no longer merely an object. It was a presence. People began to speak of it in lowered voices, as if it could hear. Some refused to remain alone in the room where it was kept. Others reported uneasy dreams after reading it, though such claims are impossible to verify. What is clear is that the first new entry changed everything. It transformed a closed chapter into an open wound. It forced the living to reconsider what they believed about death, responsibility, and finality. And it set in motion a chain of events that would draw the attention of authorities who understood that certain mysteries, once exposed, could not be allowed to spread unchecked. From that moment on, the diary was no longer just continuing. It was demanding to be answered. What followed the first impossible entry was not a sudden explosion of chaos, but something far more unsettling: persistence. The diary did not stop after one anomalous page, as though whatever force, or condition, had produced it had exhausted itself. Instead, the writing returned with a quiet regularity that mimicked life. Each day that passed seemed to invite another entry, as if time itself was still being tracked by a mind that refused to accept its own ending. The second entry appeared the following day. Then another after that. The dates advanced in a steady, almost disciplined progression, respecting the calendar with an obedience that felt disturbingly deliberate. This was not random scrawling. It followed the same temporal order the diarist had always maintained, as though death had failed to interrupt his routine. Those who dared to read the new entries noticed subtle but unmistakable changes. The handwriting, while recognizably his, showed signs of strain. Lines wavered slightly. Letters occasionally collapsed into one another, losing the careful spacing of earlier pages. It was as if the hand that wrote them was working against resistance, fatigue, stiffness, or something less tangible. The ink pooled unevenly in places, suggesting pauses where the pen lingered too long before moving on. The language, too, began to fracture. Sentences no longer flowed with the measured restraint of the earlier diary. They broke apart mid-thought. Words repeated without explanation. Certain phrases appeared again and again, sometimes within the same paragraph, sometimes across entries separated by days. There was a fixation on sensation, or the absence of it. References to heaviness became more frequent. So did mentions of pressure, of being held in place, of effort that produced no response. One line, reported by multiple witnesses, stood out for its stark simplicity: "I am awake but not risen." The phrasing was ambiguous, and that ambiguity made it worse. Awake suggested awareness. Not risen suggested immobility, confinement, or failure to return. Whether this was metaphorical or literal was impossible to determine, but no interpretation was comforting. As the diary continued to write itself, fear transformed into something heavier: obligation. Ignoring it no longer felt like an option. Each new entry seemed to demand acknowledgement, as though silence on the part of the living was itself a kind of cruelty. Yet acknowledging it carried risks of its own. The more people who knew, the harder it would be to control the story. Access to the diary became increasingly restricted. It was moved from place to place within the household, sometimes locked away, sometimes kept under watch. Still, the entries appeared. There were no signs of forced access, no disturbance of locks or seals. The diary would be opened, and there the words would be, "Waiting." This apparent defiance of physical barriers intensified suspicions. If no one could reach the diary, then how was it being written in? If someone was reaching it, then why leave no trace? Every explanation collapsed under scrutiny, leaving only the phenomenon itself, uncooperative and silent. The emotional atmosphere within the household deteriorated quickly. Sleep became difficult. Conversations turned tense and fragmented. People began watching one another with quiet suspicion, not because they believed someone was guilty, but because the alternative was too disturbing to accept. Trust eroded under the weight of uncertainty. Outside the household, rumors began to circulate more openly. A servant mentioned the diary to a relative. A relative repeated it to a priest. Details shifted with each retelling. Some said the writing bled through the pages on its own. Others claimed the diary screamed when opened. These exaggerations were not believed by those closest to the truth, but they mattered nonetheless. They signaled that the story was escaping containment. With each new entry, the tone of the writing grew more urgent, but not more coherent. There was no narrative progression, no revelation of cause or purpose. Instead, there was repetition, as if the writer were trapped in a loop of sensation and awareness. Time was noted, but not understood. Days passed, but they were described as indistinguishable. Night and day blurred into a single, continuous state. This monotony was perhaps the most disturbing element of all. If the diary had descended into madness or prophecy, it might have been dismissed as fantasy. But what it described was endurance. The persistence of consciousness without change. Awareness without escape. Some readers reported that the entries felt less like communication and more like leakage, thoughts seeping out because they had nowhere else to go. This interpretation deepened the sense that the diary was not meant to be read, only written, as though writing itself were a reflex of being. Attempts were made to test the phenomenon. On one occasion, the diary was marked discreetly, a small imperfection added to the page to determine whether it would be altered. When the next entry appeared, the mark was still there, untouched. The writing flowed around it naturally, as though accommodating a familiar flaw. This did not prove authenticity, but it eliminated certain theories. Another attempt involved moving the diary to a different room overnight, without informing everyone present. The next morning, the entry was there. The location had not mattered. As the diary continued, its presence began to exert a psychological toll. People reported feeling watched while reading it, though there was no indication of how such a sensation could be justified. Others felt an urge to stop reading mid-entry, overcome by nausea or dizziness. Whether these reactions were psychosomatic or something else entirely cannot be known, but they contributed to the growing sense that the diary was not inert. The possibility that the man had been buried alive resurfaced repeatedly, gaining traction with each new entry. If consciousness had persisted underground, then the diary represented an impossible extension of that consciousness beyond the grave. How that extension could occur was beyond explanation, but desperation often embraces the implausible when the alternative is unbearable. Yet even this theory began to fray. The timeline did not align cleanly. The entries continued beyond the period in which survival without air would have been possible. If the writing reflected lived experience, then it suggested a state not bound by biological limits. At this point, the diary ceased to be merely frightening. It became destabilizing. It undermined assumptions not only about death, but about agency, identity, and the relationship between mind and body. If a person could continue to write without a functioning body, then the boundaries that defined humanity were no longer reliable. The household reached a breaking point. The diary could not remain a private anomaly. Its persistence demanded authority, interpretation, and control. The longer it continued, the greater the risk that it would inspire panic, heretical speculation, or dangerous imitation. And so, with reluctance and fear, the decision was made to involve those whose role it was to confront the unexplainable. Not because they were expected to solve it, but because they were expected to contain it. The diary, still writing, was about to pass out of private hands. And whatever it truly represented, error, illness, deception, or something beyond comprehension, it was no longer just a family's burden. It was becoming a problem for faith, for reason, and for authority itself. When the diary was finally placed before representatives of the church, it entered a space where mystery was not merely unsettling, but dangerous. The clergy were accustomed to confronting the unexplained, but always within carefully defined boundaries. Miracles were examined, catalogued, and either affirmed or dismissed. Apparitions were scrutinized for signs of heresy or deception. Nothing that threatened doctrine was allowed to remain ambiguous for long. Ambiguity bred doubt, and doubt was the enemy of order. The priests who first examined the diary did not approach it with curiosity. They approached it with suspicion. An object that claimed continuity beyond death was not neutral. It implied either divine exception or infernal interference, and both demanded containment. Before the diary was opened, prayers were spoken, not for insight, but for protection. This detail appears repeatedly in accounts, suggesting that even the act of reading the words felt like a risk. The initial examination focused on the physical object. The binding was inspected. The pages were checked for additions or replacements. The ink was examined as closely as the technology of the time allowed. There was no obvious evidence of tampering. No missing pages. No substitutions. What unsettled the clergy most was not what they found, but what they did not. There was no clear sign of fraud. Attention then turned to the content. The priests read silently at first, exchanging glances rather than commentary. The writing did not resemble possession narratives they were familiar with. There were no blasphemies, no declarations of rebellion against God, no claims of power or revelation. This absence complicated matters. Demonic influence was expected to announce itself through excess. This diary offered only endurance and confusion. Some clergy suggested that the writing could be the work of a soul in purgatory. According to Catholic doctrine, purgatory was a place of purification, a state of suffering endured by souls destined for heaven but not yet cleansed. These souls were conscious, aware of their condition, and capable of regret. They could sometimes communicate through signs, especially if divine permission was granted. The diary, under this interpretation, became a kind of testimony, a record of suffering meant to inspire prayer or repentance among the living. But this explanation was deeply uncomfortable. Souls in purgatory were believed to suffer spiritually, not physically. They did not describe weight, pressure, or immobility. They did not mark days with dates. They did not continue mundane habits like diary writing. The diary's language was too human, too bodily, too attached to time. Others argued that the diary was a temptation, a deception meant to lure the faithful into questioning the finality of death and the authority of the church. In this view, the devil was not screaming or commanding, but whispering, using familiarity and subtlety to undermine certainty. The danger was not in the words themselves, but in the questions they provoked. This interpretation led to a more urgent response. If the diary was demonic in origin, then allowing it to circulate was unacceptable. Exposure alone could invite corruption. Yet destroying it outright posed another problem. If the diary truly was evidence of a soul in distress, then destroying it would be an act of cruelty, possibly even sacrilege. The Church found itself caught between two unacceptable options. Private debates intensified. Some clergy urged restraint, arguing that no conclusion could be reached without further observation. Others pushed for immediate suppression, warning that delay would only amplify rumor and fear. The diary had already begun to attract attention beyond the household. Servants talked. Neighbors speculated. Confessionals filled with anxious questions. The Church could not afford to appear uncertain. Exorcistic rituals were considered. This alone reveals the level of concern. Exorcism was not undertaken lightly. It was reserved for clear cases of possession or spiritual attack. To apply it to an object rather than a person was unusual, but not without precedent. There were discussions of blessing the diary, of reading prayers over it, of placing it in consecrated space to observe whether the writing would continue. At least one such ritual is said to have taken place. The diary was placed on an altar, surrounded by candles and holy symbols. Prayers were spoken. The object was left undisturbed overnight. When it was opened the next day, the writing had not stopped. This result unsettled even those most confident in their theological explanations. If the writing persisted in a consecrated space, then it resisted classification. It was neither silenced by prayer nor exposed by it. It simply continued. The diary was now considered a spiritual liability. Whatever its origin, it threatened to destabilize belief by refusing to conform to any accepted category. It was not holy enough to be celebrated, not profane enough to be condemned easily. It existed in a liminal space that doctrine was ill-equipped to manage. As concern grew, higher ecclesiastical authorities were consulted. Reports were written, carefully worded to avoid sensationalism. Details were included selectively. Emphasis was placed on containment rather than explanation. The priority was no longer understanding the diary, but preventing it from becoming a focal point for disorder. The Church's involvement changed the tone of the entire situation. What had been a private horror became an institutional problem. Access to the diary was restricted further. Only authorized individuals were permitted to view it. Notes were taken, but copies were discouraged. The diary itself became an object of custody, not inquiry. The entries continued during this period, though fewer people saw them. Those who did reported that the tone grew increasingly inward. There were fewer references to external sensation and more to isolation. The language suggested awareness of being observed, though it never addressed readers directly. This detail was particularly disturbing. It implied not communication, but coexistence, two states overlapping without interaction. For the Church, this was intolerable. Doctrine required separation. The living and the dead had distinct domains. To suggest otherwise invited chaos. If a diary could blur that boundary, then what else might? Ultimately, a decision was made that would shape the fate of the diary and the story itself. It would be removed from public awareness. Its existence would not be denied, but it would not be discussed. It would be archived, sealed, or possibly destroyed. Accounts differ. What matters is that it disappeared from open record. This act was not framed as censorship, but as protection. Protection of the faithful from confusion. Protection of doctrine from anomaly. Protection of authority from a mystery it could not resolve. In doing so, the Church did what institutions often do when confronted with the unclassifiable. It made the problem invisible. But invisibility did not erase the memory. Those who had seen the diary could not forget it. Those who had read its words carried them silently, unable to reconcile them with what they had been taught. The diary had done its damage not by proclaiming a new truth, but by quietly exposing the limits of existing ones. And in that silence, the question it raised continued to echo, unanswered. While the Church struggled to contain the diary within theological boundaries, another line of interpretation began to surface, one that sought explanation not in spirits or sin, but in the fragile and poorly understood mechanics of the human body and mind. This approach did not bring comfort. In many ways, it was just as disturbing, because it suggested that what had occurred was not supernatural at all, but a consequence of ignorance, misdiagnosis, and the terrifying limits of early medicine. In the late 18th century, medicine was in a transitional state. Physicians had begun to move away from purely religious explanations for illness, but they lacked the tools to replace belief with certainty. The human nervous system was barely understood. The brain was still largely a mystery. Concepts like consciousness, awareness, and identity were discussed philosophically rather than biologically. A person was either alive or dead. There was little room for states in between. Yet those in-between states existed, even if they were not named clearly. Conditions such as catalepsy, for example, could render a person motionless for extended periods, with muscles rigid, breathing nearly imperceptible, and responsiveness completely absent. To an 18th century physician, such a body could easily appear dead. Similarly, severe epileptic states, high fevers, or certain forms of shock could induce deep stupor. The mind might remain active while the body failed to signal life in any recognizable way. There were already documented cases across Europe of individuals declared dead who later revived, sometimes during preparation for burial, sometimes after. These accounts were not rare, but they were uncomfortable. They undermined trust in medical authority and challenged the assumption that death could be reliably identified. As a result, they were often treated as curiosities rather than warnings. Applied to the diary, these medical realities raised a horrifying possibility that the man had not died when declared, and that his consciousness had persisted far longer than anyone realized. If so, the diary's continued writing might not represent life after death, but life misidentified as death. But this explanation only went so far. Even if the man had survived for some time after burial, the diary's continued entries extended beyond what survival would have allowed. No human body could endure days underground without air. The timeline resisted purely biological explanation. To bridge that gap, some propose that the diary did not reflect real-time experience, but delayed expression, writing that occurred before death but was unnoticed or misdated. This theory struggled under scrutiny. The handwriting showed progression. The ink appeared fresh. The content reacted to time passing. These were not the static remnants of earlier writing. Attention then turned to the psychology of those around the diary. Could grief have produced a kind of collective delusion? In modern terms, this might resemble shared psychosis or suggestion-driven misinterpretation. If people expected to see something uncanny, they might read ambiguity as evidence. Slight variations in ink color could be exaggerated. Dates could be misremembered. The mind, under emotional stress, is capable of filling gaps with conviction. But this explanation also faltered. Multiple witnesses, independent of one another, described the same details. Skeptics and believers alike agreed on key facts. The phenomenon did not rely on a single observer's perception. Another possibility was deliberate fraud, either by an individual or collaboratively. Someone could have continued the diary to prolong attention, process grief, or manipulate belief. This explanation was attractive because it preserved the laws of nature. Yet it raised uncomfortable questions of motive and execution. Imitating handwriting convincingly is difficult. Maintaining consistency over multiple entries is harder still. Doing so without detection, under scrutiny, with no clear benefit, strains plausibility. Moreover, the content of the entries did not dramatize or sensationalize. They did not attempt to persuade or instruct. They simply endured. This lack of agenda undermined the fraud hypothesis. Medical thinkers of the time also lacked a framework for dissociation, automatism, or unconscious motor behavior. Today, we understand that humans can perform complex actions without conscious awareness, writing included. But in 1791, such phenomena were not recognized. Even if they had been, they would not explain how writing continued after burial. The diary thus sat at the edge of medical explanation, close enough to provoke rational analysis, but distant enough to resist resolution. It exposed a gap in understanding that neither religion nor science could fill. What troubled early medical observers most was not the writing itself, but what it implied about consciousness. If awareness could persist independently of observable life, then the criteria for death were dangerously incomplete. The diary suggested that a person could be present, suffering, thinking, and yet completely inaccessible. This idea would not gain serious scientific attention until centuries later, with the study of coma, locked-in syndrome, and minimal consciousness states. Modern medicine now recognizes that patients can be fully aware while unable to move or communicate. Some later report hearing conversations, feeling pain, or experiencing panic while presumed unconscious. Seen through this lens, the diary reads less like a supernatural artifact and more like a warning written too early to be understood. Yet even modern science cannot fully reconcile the case. Consciousness without a functioning brain remains impossible under current models. Writing without motor control remains unexplained. The diary occupies a space that neither historical medicine nor contemporary neuroscience can comfortably claim. What remains undeniable is that the case forced an uncomfortable reckoning. It demonstrated that certainty about death had been assumed rather than proven. It revealed that medical authority had limits, and that those limits could carry devastating consequences. In attempting to explain the diary medically, observers were forced to confront a deeper truth, that ignorance, not malice, may have been the most dangerous force at work. The man's death may have been mishandled. His condition may have been misunderstood. And once buried, whatever awareness remained, if any, was beyond reach. The diary thus becomes not evidence of the supernatural, but of vulnerability. Vulnerability in systems meant to protect life. Vulnerability in assumptions treated as fact. Vulnerability in the belief that death is always clear, clean, and final. Whether or not medicine can ever fully explain what happened, the diary stands as a testament to the consequences of not knowing enough. And in that sense, it is perhaps more frightening than any ghost story, because it suggests that the horror did not come from beyond the world, but from within it. By the time the diary had passed through the hands of clergy and physicians, the question was no longer whether something strange had occurred, but what kind of strange it truly was. Theories multiplied, each one attempting to impose order on a story that resisted it. None could be proven. None could be fully dismissed. And it was in the tension between these explanations that the case became most unsettling, because every possibility carried its own kind of horror. The most straightforward explanation was fraud. Someone, somewhere, had continued the diary deliberately. This theory appealed to reason because it preserved the laws of nature. No souls writing from beyond the grave. No consciousness surviving burial. Just human deception. Yet the more closely this explanation was examined, the more it unraveled. Fraud required motive. What would compel someone to undertake such an elaborate and sustained deception? There was no financial gain. No political advantage. No obvious personal benefit. The diary was not published, displayed, or used to extract favors. In fact, its continued existence brought risk rather than reward. Anyone exposed as responsible could face accusations of heresy, sacrilege, or madness. In late 18th century Spain, such accusations could destroy lives. Fraud also required opportunity. Access to the diary was limited and increasingly controlled. Yet the entries continued regardless of location, supervision, or precaution. No physical evidence of tampering was ever recorded. No changes in the binding. No disturbed seals. To maintain a hoax under those conditions would require extraordinary discipline and secrecy, sustained over time, without error. Such precision seemed unlikely, especially given the lack of payoff. Then there was the handwriting. Even today, forensic handwriting analysis is an imperfect science. In 1791, it did not exist at all. Yet those familiar with the diarist's writing insisted the hand was his. Not an imitation, not an approximation, but the same. The small idiosyncrasies, the way certain letters leaned, the pressure points where the pen paused, were consistent. Forgery could explain similarity, but not the evolution. The writing changed gradually, deteriorating in ways that mirrored physical or neurological strain rather than theatrical performance. If fraud seemed unlikely, then survival became the next possibility. Perhaps the man had not truly died when declared. Perhaps he lingered in a state of minimal awareness, misidentified as death by limited medical knowledge. This theory had historical precedent and emotional weight. It transformed the diary into something tragic rather than uncanny, the last testimony of a consciousness trapped by error. The appeal of this explanation lay in its plausibility. Premature burial was real. Misdiagnosis was common. A living man could be sealed into darkness while still aware. The diary's language, its focus on wait, stillness, isolation, aligned disturbingly well with this possibility. But the timeline resisted it. Even the most generous estimates of survival underground fell short of the duration implied by the diary's continued entries. The writing persisted beyond the point where oxygen deprivation would have ended all awareness. Unless the diary's dates were false, Survival alone could not account for the phenomenon. This led to a more uncomfortable variant of the survival theory, that the diary was not recording lived experience, but memory. That the entries were written later, perhaps during a brief revival, and misinterpreted as posthumous. Yet this too collapsed under scrutiny. The entries reference time passing externally, days marked without sensory input, suggesting ongoing awareness rather than recollection. Another theory proposed that the diary was a psychological artifact, not of the dead man, but of the living. Grief, guilt, and fear could distort perception. People might misread dates, exaggerate freshness of ink, or attribute meaning where none existed. Over time, collective belief could solidify into shared certainty. Yet this explanation struggled against the consistency of testimony. Witnesses did not agree on interpretation, but they agreed on observation. Skeptics and believers alike described the same physical details. The diary was not experienced as symbolic or ambiguous. It was experienced as materially changed. Some suggested that the diary represented an early case of what we might now call dissociative behavior, writing performed unconsciously by someone else, perhaps even without their awareness. Automatism, as a concept, would not be formally explored until much later, but the idea that the mind could act independently of conscious intent was not entirely absent. Still, this theory required a living body to write. Someone had to hold the pen. Someone had to apply pressure. No matter how divided the mind, the body had to be present. And no credible account places any individual in the act of writing the entries. The most disturbing theories emerged only after others failed. If the diary could not be explained by fraud, survival, or psychology, then something else had to be considered. Not necessarily supernatural in the dramatic sense, but something fundamentally unknown. A failure in the assumed relationship between mind, body, and time. What if consciousness did not end at the moment the body ceased to function? What if awareness could persist, briefly or imperfectly, without the mechanisms we associate with life? The diary did not suggest freedom or power. It suggested limitation. Awareness without agency. Thought without movement. This interpretation did not require ghosts or demons. It required only that human understanding of consciousness was incomplete, that the transition from life to death was not instantaneous, but uneven, that the mind might linger in a state neither alive nor dead. This idea terrified people more than any religious explanation, because it offered no comfort. There was no redemption, no punishment, no divine order, only endurance. Critics of this view argued that it bordered on speculation. There was no evidence that consciousness could exist independently of the brain. Even today, such claims remain controversial. But the diary was not offering a theory. It was presenting a problem, one that theory had failed to resolve. In the end, the most honest conclusion available was also the least satisfying, that the truth could not be known with certainty. Every explanation fit some details and contradicted others. The case resisted closure not because it lacked analysis, but because it revealed the limits of analysis itself. This unresolved tension is why the diary remains disturbing. It does not point clearly toward deception or miracle. It hovers between them, forcing the observer to choose which uncertainty they find more tolerable. The idea that death is not always final? Or the idea that the human mind is capable of creating horrors so convincing they feel supernatural? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that the diary does not belong fully to any category, that it represents a convergence of error, fear, and unknown biology. A moment where human systems failed simultaneously, medicine misjudged, ritual rushed, authority silenced, and understanding fell short. In that convergence, something emerged that could not be explained away. Not because it broke the laws of nature, but because those laws were never as complete as believed. And so the diary endures, not as proof of any single theory, but as a reminder that some questions do not resolve into answers. They simply persist, like ink on a page that was never meant to be written.